The wind swept across the plains like a restless spirit, rattling the wooden shutters of the small cabin and sending shivers down anyone unfortunate enough to be outside. Snow had begun to fall in earnest, thick, wet flakes that clung to the rough edges of the wooden fences and blanketed the land in a choking white silence. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled unevenly, its warmth struggling against the relentless chill that crept through the gaps in the walls. The room was sparse, furnished with little more than a worn wooden table, a few chairs, and a small cot in the corner, the mattress thin and lumpy. Yet in this harsh wilderness, it was a haven for anyone seeking even a fraction of comfort. Outside, the snowstorm had grown heavier, and the horizon had disappeared under a solid white curtain. Horses huddled in the small corral, their breath steaming in the frigid air, ears flicking back and forth at every gust of wind. The distant hills were ghostly silhouettes, their contours softened and blurred by the falling snow, making the landscape seem both familiar and strangely alien. A lone figure emerged from the swirling white, a woman whose thin coat offered little protection from the cold. Her boots were soaked, her fingers numb, and her face pale from the wind's unrelenting bite. She moved with a weary determination, knowing she had little choice if she hoped to survive the night. The cabin door, made of splintered pine and held together with a stubborn latch, creaked as she pushed it open. The sudden burst of warmth from the fireplace hit her like a wave, and she stumbled inside, shaking off snow that had clung to her hair and clothing. She pressed her gloved hands to her cheeks, letting the fire's warmth seep into her frozen skin. The cabin was empty, silent except for the occasional crackle from the fire. A few small signs of life indicated that someone had been here recently, a half-full mug on the table, a pair of worn boots neatly placed by the door, and the faint smell of tobacco smoke lingering in the air. She had been traveling for days, following trails that had long since disappeared under snow, guided only by instinct and the faint memory of the nearest settlement. Her horse had faltered several miles back, unable to handle the weight of the deep drifts, forcing her to continue on foot. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and fatigue pulled at her every step, yet she knew she could not rest outside, the cold would claim her before dawn. The warmth of the fire was irresistible, yet she hesitated, aware that the cabin might be occupied. The wilds of the frontier were dangerous, and strangers were not always welcomed. She weighed her options with the care of someone who had long learned that caution could be the difference between life and death. The cabin had a rugged simplicity that spoke of its owner's life, practical, hard, and unyielding. A few shelves held tin plates and a kettle, while an old rifle rested against the wall, its stock polished from use but still showing signs of wear. The air smelled faintly of sweat and leather, a testament to the life of labor outside, and beneath that, the lingering tang of smoke from countless fires. Her eyes moved over the room, noting every detail as if memorizing a map. In the corner, she spotted the cot, its thin blanket inviting in a way that promised more warmth than she had felt in days. Her body ached with the need for rest, her muscles stiff from trudging through snow, and despite every instinct telling her caution, she found herself moving toward it. As she approached the cot, a creak from the floor made her freeze. She glanced toward the door, then the shadows cast by the firelight along the walls, trying to discern any movement. A figure emerged from the darker corner of the room, a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a coat dusted with snow. His face was rugged, weathered by wind and sun, his eyes sharp and assessing. He carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to solitude and the unpredictable dangers of frontier life. The initial shock of seeing another person quickly gave way to cautious curiosity. I didn't mean to intrude," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the very air might betray her presence. Her words came out unevenly, shaped by the cold and exhaustion. The man's eyes softened slightly, though the tension in his posture remained. "It's a storm out there. You're welcome to warm yourself by the fire," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying the authority of someone used to commanding attention without raising it. He gestured toward the space near the hearth, then paused, studying her with an intensity that made her shift uneasily on her feet. She hesitated, her mind racing through the warnings her mother had once given her about strangers and the dangers of the open plains. But the fire, the cold, and her own weakening body overpowered that caution. She stepped closer, allowing herself to be drawn toward the cot at the corner. She removed her gloves, revealing red-streaked hands stiff with frost, and lowered herself carefully onto the thin mattress. The blanket, coarse and scratchy, was still warmer than anything she had felt in days, and she pulled it tightly around herself, letting a small sigh escape. The man watched for a long moment, then finally settled near the fireplace, tending to the flames with careful hands. The room was quiet, save for the occasional snap of burning wood and the whistle of wind outside. He did not speak again immediately, allowing her to regain some composure, to adjust to the sudden comfort of warmth and safety. She felt a complex mixture of relief and unease, relief at escaping the cold, unease at sharing space with someone she barely knew. "Where are you headed?" he finally asked, his tone conversational but not pressing. There was no judgment in his question, only genuine curiosity. "North. I was trying to reach the next settlement," she replied, her voice steadier now. She did not offer more details, knowing that answers could be used against her in these wild lands. He nodded slowly, accepting her response without further questioning. Hours seemed to stretch as the storm raged outside, and slowly, the two settled into a tentative rhythm. She warmed her fingers by the fire, while he moved about the cabin with practiced ease, stacking firewood, checking the latch on the door, ensuring the small space was secure. There was an unspoken agreement between them. Silence was safer than conversation, and caution was a necessary companion in a world where the slightest misstep could lead to disaster. Night deepened, and the storm showed no sign of relenting. The woman, exhausted beyond measure, eventually drifted into a light, uneasy sleep on the cot, the blanket wrapped tightly around her. The man remained near the fire, watchful, his presence a steady, reassuring force. Outside, the wind howled, the snow piling ever higher, yet within the cabin, a fragile warmth persisted, a small sanctuary against the harshness of the frontier. Time passed with the slow, measured pace of the wilderness. The fire burned low, embers glowing like tiny beacons of life in the otherwise dark and silent cabin. The woman's breathing deepened as she slept, the tension in her body slowly easing. The man finally allowed himself to relax slightly, leaning back against the wall, rifle within reach but unused, listening to the storm and the quiet rhythm of her rest. The night was long, the snow relentless, yet within the cabin, a fragile bond began to form, a connection forged in shared survival rather than words. Each understood the unspoken rules of this frontier life. Trust was rare, caution necessary, and yet, in the midst of the cold and isolation, human warmth became a lifeline. What had begun as a simple act of seeking shelter had evolved into something more profound, a silent acknowledgement of each other's presence, a shared moment of humanity in a world defined by harshness and solitude. Morning eventually came, gray and muted, with the storm finally beginning to ease. Snow lay thick across the landscape, sparkling faintly in the weak light of dawn. The cabin, now filled with the soft glow of morning, seemed almost like a different place than the one that had been battered by the storm hours before. The woman stirred, stretching and blinking against the light, feeling the restorative power of the warmth and rest. The man, still watchful but less tense, offered a nod, a simple gesture of recognition and welcome. The storm outside had created a temporary world within the cabin, a place where survival required not just strength but cooperation, where the warmth of fire and human presence was a precious commodity. And though they had not spoken much of the world beyond those walls, both understood that this shared night had changed something, however subtly, in the landscape of their lives. In a world defined by unpredictability and peril, the smallest acts of kindness, the briefest moments of trust, could be enough to endure, and even to surprise.